Welcome back to the Save It for Parts channel. And before I even get started on this video, both cats are all over my new product here. They seem to think this is the Donnie and Fluff cat toy channel, so they just will not stay out of this box. Anyway, today we've got a new telescope. And of course, since this is the Save It for Parts channel, by new, I mean old, used, and possibly broken. But at least it was cheap, about $50 at an auction. We're going to pull it out, and if we can keep the cats off of it for 10 seconds, we'll see what we've got. So this is a Solomark telescope. I have never heard of this brand, which means it's probably pretty cheap and may or may not be any good, but that remains to be seen. We do have our main telescope tube here, which has some damage to it. I'm hoping that's not a huge deal, since the shell or outer skin of this isn't really optically important, but if anything else in here is damaged or bent, that could affect things. We have an equatorial base. Now, this is what was missing from my other telescope, and I ended up making a Dobsonian mount, which is okay, but is really hard to do any fine adjustments. This thing seems to have a bunch of knobs and adjustment wheels, and it might be a little easier to fine-tune it, track moving planets, get it aimed in on things we want to look at. Again, remains to be seen if that's all there. Got some more little knobs and bits for that. Got our little aiming scope and some eyepieces. More eyepieces and stuff. I think this is a smartphone mount, so that could come in handy for doing any kind of astrophotography. Some more stuff that I don't know what it is. I think this is where the eyepieces live, and this might be a filter or something. More little knobs and some lens caps and things. And then we've got our tripod, which weighs almost nothing, so you know the quality on this is bottom of the barrel. And this definitely seems to be a some assembly required piece. So I'm going to have to do something I very rarely resort to, reading the manual. And this thing sure does have a lot of bits and pieces to it. Well, as far as I can tell, this has all its pieces and everything seems to work. The fine adjustment knobs are pretty finicky, and you have to tighten or loosen some of the clamps first. It's not a super high precision instrument. If you tighten or loosen things, everything jumps out of position, so it's definitely not professional grade, but it might be a little bit better than that Dobsonian for fine adjustment. It feels like I can feel the gears slipping when I adjust these, so as I rotate it around, it does not feel very smooth. I can feel things jerking around in there. I don't know if there's metal gears in here or plastic, or if I'm just grinding things away, so I don't think much of the internal mechanism of this mount so far. And the manual is unfortunately really vague about how to actually use and adjust this telescope. It has 5 incredibly detailed pages about assembly, and then the alignment and use one tells you to pick which galaxy you're in, and then start your adjustments, and then just do the adjustments, and everything should work fine. So I think it's kind of assuming that you already know how to use an equatorial mount, which I really don't, but I can watch some other YouTube videos and figure that out. The sky finally cleared up enough to get the telescope out and at least look at the moon, which is about the only thing out at this point of the night. It's okay. I'm really not impressed with this telescope. It's much worse than my really cheap 1960s telescope. The eyepieces are much worse. The included smartphone adapter is also pretty useless. You can eventually kind of line up all the elements from the phone to the adapter to the eyepiece to the telescope. By the time you get it all lined up, you have to readjust the telescope because whatever you're looking at is completely moved out of view. And then you really only get like half of the field of view that you would with your eye. These smartphone adapters, they're just kind of gimmicky. I don't think they're really worth using. There doesn't seem to really be anything wrong with the scope. It's just not a very good product. I'm definitely glad that I only paid $50 for this thing instead of the $200 plus that it goes for new online. I've seen these called a hobby killer in some astronomy magazines. They're the kind of thing you get for Christmas when you're 12 years old. You go outside in December or January, you look at some stuff, you're disappointed with what you see, you throw the telescope in the closet, and you take up another hobby and never get into astronomy again. I don't know what I think of this equatorial mount so far. It seems pretty wiggly, it's not very stable. All of these gears feel like they're grinding when I make adjustments, so it feels very cheap. It feels like it's not going to last very long. I don't know if I really like it or not, but we might as well try the good scope on it and see how that looks. We still have the 6-inch rings from that Criterion, This mount is really sized for the 5-inch Solomark, but maybe we can use it for the Criterion. I also still have the counterweight from the Criterion, even though I never had the equatorial mount for it. So if this mount and counterweight aren't quite big enough, we might be able to just stick this on there. Now the bolt holes in this base plate aren't big enough for the Criterion bolts, so we might have to go one step further, pop this plate off. This is why I never throw any metal scraps away. Even if it's relatively small, I can still probably use it for something like this. I might make this a little bit bigger than the original one. Well, this thing is starting to look like a real telescope, although it's definitely kludged together. I've had to really extend the counterweight arm here. I've had to put the extra big counterweight on. It's still not 100% balanced. I need to move the tube back and forth a little bit, but it's good enough. It works with the gears, and hopefully that'll keep working for a little while before I wreck everything by putting too much weight on it. So this is kind of working and kind of not. These little gears on this equatorial mount just aren't big enough for this giant telescope, and they're already kind of stripped out from the other scopes, so they're just not able to adjust very finely. So I'm not having any more luck with the giant telescope tube on that mount. I'm going to go ahead and put the small one, back on there. We're going to put this back in the Dobsonian. We'll go ahead and just use that with the Dobsonian. That's also frustrating and hard to adjust, but at least it's pretty stable once I have it adjusted. So unfortunately that Solomark telescope turned out to be just complete garbage. The scope's useless, the eyepieces are useless, the cell phone mount's useless, the equatorial mount is useless, the whole thing is just trash. So I'm kind of disappointed that I wasted $50 on it, but at least I didn't spend more than that. This is a cautionary tale not to buy these gimmicky off-brand telescopes on Amazon or eBay or wherever. They just are trash. Buy a name brand from the modern age, or buy an old one like that Criterion from the 60s. That turned out to be a pretty good scope. Stay far, far, far away from the discount imported telescopes. They are not worth your time. They will make your kids hate astronomy. They will be hobby killers. Now you might be saying, wait, this isn't a fair review. You got a used telescope really cheap, and why are you calling it a piece of junk? Well, you know, realistically, if it hasn't held up to use, if it's this destroyed from somebody else using it, do you really want a scope like that that's going to fall apart, that's going to grind its own gears down, that's going to go out of focus? If you're going to buy a telescope, I would highly recommend getting a decent name brand with good reviews. And if you're going to get a used telescope, look for something nicer that's a few years old. That Criterion Dynascope I got from the 1960s was in worse condition, had probably been used more than the Solomark. It was filthy, the paint was chipped, I had to take the mirrors out and literally wash them before I could use it. And after all that, it looks better, has a better picture, and is overall a much higher quality scope than this cheap thing from the mid-2010s. Now this isn't a sponsored review. Nobody sent me this telescope to try out, and I'm kind of glad nobody sent me this thing because I have nothing good to say about it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.